Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this. We're really appreciative of your invitation. Congratulations to the State Library, which has been serving California for 170 years now. Also to Sutro Library, which has been serving Californians ably for 107 years. And as was mentioned before, this is a big 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which we will get into in a little bit as soon as our program continues. 5 years ago, Susie and I and two other friends, former Capitol reporters, Jeff Raimundo and LaVally, wrote a book called Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. As you might expect, the book was primarily about white men because women and minorities generally were banned from the corridors of political power throughout the entire 19th century and most of the 20th century. And we wanted to figure out, well, what did women do during this time, and what contributions did they make to California's rich political history? So we went to some California history books and couldn't find much at all. So we started digging through old newspaper files at the State Library, going back to the Gold Rush, letters and personal collections at the State Archives, at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, plus oral histories and interviews with interviews in esoteric publications and even postgraduate theses. I think Susie, however, had the most tedious job.
I had to go through all the statements. I enjoyed doing this, all the statement of votes since 1912. So that was well over 100 elections that I had gone through. And I wrote down the names of every woman who ran for statewide office, congressional office, or legislative office. And by the way, there were close to 4,000 women. And then we would individually look them up when we could not find anything on these women in books. And most of the information that we got, especially in long ago time, came through newspapers. So it was a very, very interesting way of looking up the information for our books.
We tell their stories and we turn them into a book with the foreword by State Librarian Greg Lucas. And those stories are the heart of our presentation tonight. This will be a tag team presentation. Both Susie and I will participate. And one final reminder that if you have a question, go to your chat icon at the bottom of your screen and ask a question if you have one, and we'll be glad to answer questions afterwards.
Steve and
Susie, Paving the Way, the women's movement.
Steve and Susie, we just want to let you know that sometimes your audio is going in and out. So I don't know if you guys have a way to get closer to your mic.
We'll do our best.
Yeah, thank you.
As we write in Paving the Way, the women's movement from statehood through suffrage to the present time is a story of grit, determination, and resilience in the face of discrimination and cultural stereotypes. Unfortunately, many of these trailblazing women have been completely lost to history. Now, women's suffrage in the US had been on the public's radar since 1848, the year gold was discovered in El Dorado County. A group of activists met in Seneca Falls, New York, and denounced what they called the grievous bondage of women. And in 1878, it was a Northern Californian, US Senator Aaron Sargent of Nevada City, who first introduced those 29 words that decades later, well after his death, would become the 19th Amendment. There might have been some pillow talk at work here. The senator's wife, Ellen Sargent, was a leading voting rights advocate and a close friend of famed suffragist Susan B. Anthony. Now, while women in the East were consumed by the fight for suffrage, women in the new undeveloped state of California had other concerns. Many women out West had taken up the cause of temperance. The gold rush was known for its unruly insobriety. In fact, throughout much of the last half of the 19th century, temperance was the most popular reform movement. In the sprawling mining camps with their lawless, hard-drinking prospectors, drinking was a way of life, and alcohol was blamed for crime, poverty, abuse, and disease. One San Francisco publication in the 1850s, called The Pioneer, or California Monthly, published a series of letters from a California woman to her sister in Massachusetts. She talked of wealthy miners earning hundreds of dollars a day who became drunken gamblers and lost all their money. In the span of 24 days, she wrote, we have had murders, fearful accidents, bloody deaths, a mob, whippings, a hanging, a suicide attempt, and a fatal duel. Into this rowdy environment strode Sarah Pellet, a fearless temperance advocate who it is said was the first woman to give a public lecture in San Francisco. That was in 1854. She was a college graduate from Ohio and had arrived in California after an arduous voyage from New York through the mosquito-infested Panama jungle and then up the coast to the Golden Gate. She charged $1 to hear her speak. The Alta California newspaper described her as a small, neat woman in her 30s of considerable intellectual power, a clear mind, and pleasing address. Because she was such a curiosity item, the newspaper gave her first San Francisco speech advanced publicity and predicted a good turnout. The reviews, however, were terrible. The newspaper said her voice is not pleasant and her manner of delivery is anything but agreeable. Miss Pellet does not possess any of the qualifications for an interesting lecturer, it said. Another article said many in the audience seemed in agony. The men controlled themselves and took another chew on their tobacco, while the ladies smiled and yawned. But a few bad reviews in the male press did not stop Sarah Pellet from traveling from one mining camp to another, preaching the evils of alcohol. She praised the state of Maine, which had just enacted a tough law prohibiting the manufacture and sale of liquor. Women were in short supply in the camps. Pellet proposed importing 5,000 young marriageable girls from New England who would be consigned to the Sons of Temperance and become companions to non-drinking men in the mining camps. These days, that sort of sounds like a felony. If the temperance advocates looked to their political representatives for leadership, it was a waste of time. The state's first legislature, seated in San Jose, earned the nickname Legislature of 1,000 Drinks, because the lawmakers, of course, would hit the saloons after every session, and subsequent legislatures didn't help either. In San Francisco, meanwhile, Mary Ellen Pleasant, a former slave, was creating an improbable legacy. She had started out as a cook in a boarding house for men. She would eavesdrop when the men talked about their various investments. She had some family money and she put it into mining stocks and Wells Fargo, becoming rich in the process. She helped finance John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and also used much of her fortune to shelter and find work for runaway slaves. She also confronted the issue of racial discrimination in the city and used the courts to stand up for her rights. In 1866, nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks, she sued a San Francisco streetcar company for refusing to let her and other African Americans ride in their cars. She forced the company to change its policy. In San Jose, meanwhile, one woman named Clara Foltz used both the legislature and the courts to push for equality. While living in San Jose in 1878, her husband suddenly abandoned Clara and her 5 small children. In a panic to feed her family, she worked as a seamstress, but she really wanted to be a lawyer, like her father. California codes, however, clearly said that only white males could practice law. So she wrote a bill to allow women to become lawyers, and she gave it to a San Jose senator who introduced the measure in the legislature. Foltz lobbied it through the legislature, but had no idea if Governor William Irwin would even sign it. Irwin had not tipped his hand, and as the deadline for action approached, Foltz waited outside the governor's office with other lobbyists. At about 15 minutes before the midnight deadline, someone emerged from inside the governor's office and shouted that the lady lawyer's bill was dead. Foltz, devastated and angry, slipped past the security guard and found herself inside the governor's inner office, where he was busy acting on legislation. Nervous and trembling, she told Irwin that he needed to sign that bill. The governor then fished the document out of a pile of bills destined to be vetoed, read it over, and told Foltz, you know, this is a good bill. I'm going to sign it. Years later, Foltz published a woman's magazine and serialized her life story. And she said that just seconds after the governor signed the bill, the clock struck 12. Foltz then decided to attend the recently opened Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. She paid her $10 tuition and took classes for 3 days before she was escorted out and told that the school did not admit women. So she and a female colleague, Laura DeForce Gordon, sued Hastings to get in. The case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and they won. Holtz is barely a footnote today, but she was the first female lawyer in California, the first woman deputy district attorney in the US, and the first woman to run for governor. She created the public defender's office in California and the concept of the parole system, and she courageously fought to open doors for women in the legal profession. A few years later, a landmark struggle for equal access to education was playing out in San Francisco. Separating students by their ethnicity and skin color had been a California practice since the early days of statehood. In 1880, a new California law entitled all children to a public education, but local policy still kept San Francisco Chinese American children out of the public schools. That policy had been pushed by city school superintendent Andrew Jackson Mulder, who referred to minorities as, quote, inferior races. Mulder, who would die in 1895, would be eulogized, though, as a high-minded, earnest, liberal, and ever-courteous individual. In the mid-1880s, Mary Tape, whose daughter Mamie was born in the US, challenged Mulder's policy, which excluded her daughter from San Francisco schools. And she won, opening public schools to Chinese American children. In a final blast to Mulder, she wrote a letter to a San Francisco newspaper. Quote, "Is it a disgrace to be born Chinese? Didn't God make us all? May you, Mr. Mulder, never be persecuted the way you have persecuted little Mamie Tape." The arduous fight for women's suffrage in California was epic. It spanned 4 decades. Women knew they would never be equal to men until they were allowed to vote. But men were territorial. Every time a bill was introduced in the legislature, they would shoot it down. Women were not smart enough to vote, some said. Others said women were too pure and wholesome to be sullied by the dark arts of politics. Whatever the trumped-up reason, suffrage was denied. In 1869, Wyoming, a territory with 9,000 residents, had become a pioneer in gender equity, as it was the first territory or state to give women the vote. One reason, almost all of those 9,000 citizens were men. Offering women the vote, it was thought, might entice them to come west and marry all those mining men, and thus lead to statehood. Around the same time, Emily Pitt Stevens, a brash, self-described female revolutionist, earned a place in the pantheon of early suffrage advocates and opinion leaders. Her detractors called her Pitsy. She bought a San Francisco newspaper called the Mercury and turned it into a first suffrage journal in the West. She hired women to set type in defiance of the Printers Union, and she helped found the California Women's Suffrage Association. She also created quite a stir. The San Francisco Examiner called it a clamor when she and some friends disrupted a lecture by an anti-suffragist in the city's venerable Platts Hall. The news accounts indicated they mocked the speaker, and laughed after she made her points. And when an anti-suffrage San Francisco assemblyman in the audience tried to quiet her down, she reportedly drew a pistol on him. Under the headline of female hoodlums and rowdy women, one newspaper called it a disgraceful scene. For her part, in a letter to San Francisco newspapers, Pitt Stevens denied pointing a derringer at the assemblyman and blamed anti-suffragists for spreading lies about the cause. Beginning in the 1870s, as women sought to remake public life, the Women's Christian Temperance Union became a powerful force in California politics. It drew thousands of anti-liquor advocates to a movement that was a harbinger of the women's rights battles to come. It emboldened increasing numbers of women to push back against cultural strictures that confined them to the political shadows. In time, temperance crusaders would work with elite white women's clubs to curb prostitution, end child labor, and censure what they considered to be, quote, impure books. Many of the leading women involved in the fight for female voting rights were also veterans of the temperance movement, and that turned out to be a two-edged sword. On the one hand, those with a background in temperance activism added some political savvy and know-how to the suffrage movement. But on the other, it created a powerful political enemy, the liquor industry, which feared women voters would support prohibition. Now, lawmakers, many beholden to the liquor industry, had continually scuttled attempts to give women the vote. But in 1895, there was a twist. One of the assemblymen during that 1895 session was a pretty famous bartender by trade and a one-time minstrel performer. His name was William Boothby, and he was from San Francisco. Boothby, in fact, had written the definitive book on mixology, which sold 50,000 copies back then. He even named a cocktail after himself, but he turned the tables on the industry that had given him his livelihood. And when a woman's suffrage measure came before the lower house, after much wrangling, it was approved 46 to 29, and William Boothby, the bartender, was one of the aye votes. The measure, however, later failed in the Senate. And later after that, the legislature gave the all-male California electorate a chance to do what state lawmakers wouldn't do, give women the vote. A statewide suffrage measure was placed on the ballot. Women had been closely identified with the temperance movement, and the liquor industry feared women voters would enact prohibition ordinances throughout the state. The industry was extremely powerful in the large cities of San Francisco and Oakland. It mobilized a last-minute statewide attack, sending flyers to every bar, restaurant, liquor store, and boarding house, warning customers that their next beer could be their last. The tactic worked. In immigrant communities, especially where liquor was a crucial staple, the men turned on the women. In San Francisco, the state's largest city, which also seemed to have a tavern on every street corner, the vote against suffrage was 3-1, and the measure failed statewide by a large margin. In fact, all 9 Bay Area counties voted against the suffrage measure. For the next 15 years, suffrage activists were in despair. Many suffrage clubs folded. Mary McHenry Keith of Berkeley almost single-handedly held the movement together, at one point writing a personal check for $500 to the state's Equal Suffrage Association, the equivalent of $14,000 today. One state senator told her that sure, he would vote for suffrage, but only if she could convince all of the saloons, hotels, restaurant keepers, liquor dealers, and other purveyors of alcoholic beverages in his district, all of them, to support women's voting rights. Frustrated by the treatment of women year after year, Keith said women needed to continue to kick up a fuss until they got the vote. She told the Berkeley Gazette, "Is there not something in the Bible about taking the kingdom of heaven by violence?" At the same time, Catherine Reed Ballantyne briefly published The Yellow Ribbon in San Francisco, which was devoted to sharing information about women's suffrage on the West Coast. Copies of the newspaper are safely tucked away at the State Library in Sacramento. Ballantyne scored an interview with President Roosevelt, a friend of her father. The result, though, was disappointing. He said that the public sentiment was not yet strong enough for him to do anything about women's voting rights. Now, there were many villains during the long suffrage battle, but none as nefarious as James Gillette. At the 1906 State Republican Convention in Santa Cruz, Gillette struck up a conversation with a leading suffragist and told her that he was a candidate to be the party's nominee for governor, and said he believed in their cause and promised that should he win the nomination and the general election, the women would have a friend in the governor's office. Gillette did win, but when San Francisco suffragist Lillian Coffin asked him to fulfill his pledge, he replied, "I was only joshing you. I didn't mean what I said." And besides, he continued, women belonged at home taking care of the kids. Ridiculed, ignored, and deceived, women tried a new tack, civic improvement. They formed women's clubs up and down the state. They couldn't vote, but they convinced presidents, governors, and legislators to save large swaths of ancient redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the North Coast and the Sierra foothills. They investigated tainted milk in Southern California that put infants at risk and discovered that many dairy cows had tuberculosis. Their work led to greater government oversight. In the Bay Area, after the 1906 earthquake, women worked closely with health officials to rid the cities of an infestation of rats that carried bubonic plague. Shortly after that, suffragists made a strategic decision to hitch their wagon to Hiram Johnson and the Progressive Republicans, who had split off from the main Republican Party. They and the Progressives found common cause in pushing the idea of political reform, and their message, if men had made such a mess of politics, why not sweep them out of office and give women a try? In 1910, the Progressives now in power, placed a suffrage measure on a statewide election ballot in 1911. Leading suffragist Selena Solomons, a prominent San Franciscan, understood that to be successful, the campaign had to expand beyond the socially elite and overcome the class divisions that were prevalent in 1896. Minority women still were excluded, but white working class women, shop girls, clerks, and secretaries were brought into the movement. Solomons created the Votes for Women Club in a loft on Sutter Street and invited working women to come for an affordable lunch. An entree or salad cost 5 cents, the equivalent of $1.35 today. Once there, they listened to lectures and were given campaign materials to take back to their neighborhoods so they could lobby their brothers, their fathers, and boyfriends. And the women had a loyal ally in the San Francisco Call newspaper, incidentally published by Clara Foltz's brother, Charles Shortridge. For media consumption, the women devised unusual publicity stunts. Several women refused to sign the census documents because they argued without the vote, they weren't full citizens. One of their biggest problems was trying to attract men, the voters after all, to even listen to a suffrage speech. And that's when they had a brainstorm to enlist the aid of a spiffy 1910 Packard touring car as a man magnet. The car was quite the attraction. It was a convertible that sat 7 people, the fanciest car on the road. New, it cost $4,000, the equivalent of 7 or 8 times the average Californian's yearly salary. They called it the Blue Liner. They'd park it on a busy street corner and employ a bugler, attracting attention. And then the women would wait for the male pedestrians to stop by and kick the tires, look under the hood, admire the upholstery, and generally see what the fuss was all about. Once a large crowd gathered, the women would pop up and deliver a pro-suffrage speech. One newspaper reported that at 3 separate stops in San Francisco, the car and the women attracted more than 1,000 voters and lots of reporters. The Blue Liner also ferried speakers to small towns up and down California, as well as remote factories, farms, and ranches. In one town of 400, about 200 men showed up. In Vallejo, they would park it amid the cigar stores and Nickelodeons and attract young sailors from the naval shipyard. In Santa Rosa, it was parked next to a knife-throwing booth at the Native Sons of Golden West celebration. The Los Angeles Times and its blustery publisher, Harrison Gray Otis, led the campaign against suffrage. Women, he said, should not be burdened with the duty and responsibility of voting. 9 days before the election, the Times printed an article by State Senator J.B. Sanford. In near hysterics, he argued that women's suffrage was a disease that caused divorces and crime. He said it was only supported by, quote, mannish female politicians, sissy men, and women who wished they had been born men. Sanford also wrote, Mr. Voter, how would you like to come home some evening and find the children dirty and hungry? No supper for you, and wifey locked up in a jury room with 11 men. This is what women's suffrage means. Well, an angry suffragist from Santa Rosa responded, if politics is a dirty pool, then we must conclude that it was a great mistake in the first place to give the ballot to men, and it should be taken from them as soon as possible. Susan B. Anthony once had a more blunt response to Sanford. As his species would soon be extinct, Anthony said, she would advise canning him for the benefit of posterity. The Chronicle once called her a female agitator. Now, the campaign went everywhere. One society woman left her home in Madera to ride horseback through the hills and mountains, giving small talks, many of them without dismounting. Suffragists also created stereopticons or slideshows to show in movie theaters before full-length silent films. Just the year before, 1910, in Old Sacramento was the first movie, in Old California was the first movie ever shot in California. The message was clear. Women pay taxes to support government and they obey the laws. Thus, they should have something to say as to their making. Most California newspapers supported the suffrage amendment. In this Sacramento Bee cartoon, a man is sitting at his desk thinking, why shouldn't my mother vote? Suffrage campaign leaders considered San Francisco to be a critical challenge. It was hostile territory, but its population exceeded 400,000 and could not be ignored. The city had turned on the suffragists in 1896, and the city's liquor industry remained a powerful and persuasive force. The campaign enlisted prominent authors to support the cause: Mark Twain, Frank Norris, Jack London, just to name a few. But the anti-suffragists were confident of victory, and they were boosted by an 11th hour political attack. The day before the election, full-page newspaper ads showed up throughout the state. They contained incendiary remarks from noted suffragists. For example, Anna Shaw was quoted as suggesting women would enact prohibition if given the vote, and then she was quoted as saying, "I would place a woman policeman at the door of every saloon and dance hall, every nickel theater, and every factory." Another suffragist was quoted as saying that any woman who does not earn her own living should be considered a prostitute. Two angry suffragists stormed the San Francisco Chronicle and said the quotes were fabricated. The Chronicle, though, said they had already received $500 for the ad. There would be no retraction. On election day, the Chronicle reported that women kept a watchful eye on the voting. At one polling place, a man said he was voting for suffrage, based on the same theory he would use if he was having a bad tooth pulled. It had to be done sometime, he said, might as well get it over with. At another polling place, a man snapped at a suffragist, "You ought to be at home, getting breakfast for the family." The woman responded, "I was up at 6 a.m., Mr. Voter, and prepared the family breakfast. And now I'm helping them by working here." The last mission for the Blue Liner was to ferry to the polls old, broken down men who lived out their lives at the San Francisco Relief Home. Some were blind, others couldn't walk. One man told a reporter, "We fellows that are on the scrap heap ain't afraid of the woman." Anti-suffragists, backed by the still powerful liquor industries, were confident of victory. They didn't even bother staffing individual polling places. Instead, they went to San Francisco bars and handed out leaflets with the drinks, tying the suffrage movement to the Prohibition campaign. Selena Solomons wrote the only comprehensive account of the campaign and told of the total despair on election night as the first returns, which mostly were from San Francisco, indicated that the suffrage measure was losing by a large margin. She went to a vote watch party at the Dreamland skating rink, but the tally was going so poorly, she couldn't take it anymore. She left the party and just wandered along the streets of San Francisco in despair. At one point, she overheard two men saying that suffragists merely wanted to destroy everyone's home life. She turned to the men and said, "We don't want to destroy homes, but we do desire and intend on having a voice in our own government. And if you men continue to withhold it from us, we'll take it." The following day, dispirited campaign leaders plotted strategy for the next suffrage attempt. And then something totally unexpected happened. Late uncounted votes started trickling in from small towns, from farmers, ranchers, and miners in the cow counties, and they were breaking heavily for the suffrage amendment. Even in wine-growing Napa and Sonoma counties, despite the scare tactics of the liquor industry. 2 days after the election, the voting rights measure narrowly pulled ahead and stayed that way, eventually winning by a scant 3,500 votes, equal to about 1 vote per precinct. This time, Santa Clara, Contra Costa, Napa, Sonoma, and Solano counties supported the measure. And get this, Southern California, home of the rabidly anti-suffrage Los Angeles Times, put the measure over the top. California thus became the 6th and largest state to enact women's suffrage. And remember that anti-suffragist Senator J.B. Sanford? In a Ukiah newspaper, actually his newspaper, he took one last swipe at the victorious women and their perceived vanity. He warned that when they registered the vote, they would have to reveal their true ages. He figured that would keep them from registering. Well, all along, opponents had argued that women really didn't want the vote. The first major test of voter enthusiasm among women was 2 months later, when Los Angeles held municipal elections. 70,000 women stood in long lines to register, and 65,000 of them actually voted, a much higher percentage than the men. And how's this for irony? The LA Times, vehemently anti-suffrage, had begged women to register and vote in order to defeat a slate of socialist candidates. They did, and the Times gave them credit for saving the city. One leading suffragist put it this way: the humor of the situation, the Times on its knees to women whom it had abused for years, was so pungent. As for prohibition, women voters did shut down the bars in a series of special elections in Palo Alto, Los Gatos, Sunnyvale, and Mountain View. But elsewhere, they helped defeat prohibition measures. Women, it turned out, were discerning voters who took their responsibilities seriously. Securing the franchise in California had been an arduous 4-decade ordeal. Women had been ridiculed, ignored, deceived, and outmaneuvered by the male power structure. Most of the early pioneers had passed on before the final victory. Ellen Clark Sargent, who had turned her San Francisco home into a suffrage headquarters and had been in the forefront of the movement for most of those 4 decades, died 3 months before the election victory. Triumphant suffragists went on the road to other states, offering advice on how to win the vote. And within 7 years, 9 states, including New York and Michigan, approved women's suffrage, providing further impetus to those seeking an all-encompassing national voting rights amendment. Still, Congress balked, but California was moving forward.
In 1918, the first 4 women were elected to the state assembly after trouncing male candidates, and all of them had major accomplishments to their credit, from delivering water to farms in the San Joaquin Valley, to enacting criminal justice reform, consumer protection, and minimum wage for women in the workplace. 2 of the women had Bay Area ties. Esto Broughton of Modesto nearly died as a youngster when she contracted spinal tuberculosis that stunted her growth at 4 feet 6 inches and left her handicapped. She went to Cal, was on a champion women's crew, and she graduated with honors from the university's jurisprudence program, even though the dean argued that women were too emotional to become lawyers. At 28, she was elected to the assembly and became its expert on water and irrigation issues. Anna Saylor was from Berkeley. After a fact-finding visit to San Quentin, she devoted her energies to criminal justice reform, such as separating women from men in prison, preventing boys as young as 8 years old from being housed in jails with hardened criminals, abolishing the death penalty for minors, and offering inmates psychiatric help. In the mid-1920s, as Director of Social Welfare, Saylor became the first woman to serve in a governor's cabinet. A third pioneer in the legislature was Grace Doris of Bakersfield. Actually, her husband was slated to run for that seat, but he was sent overseas to fight in World War I. She took his place and campaigned against Kern County's wealthy land barons, who owned 1 million acres of property and financed her opponent. Her first bill, which later became law, improved working conditions for domestic workers. And from Orville, Elizabeth Hughes became a leader in public education, boosting state funding for education and helping to grow Chico Normal School, which later became Chico State. During her campaign, her male opponent said women were too weak, that the legislature was no place for a, quote, pink tea woman. Hughes reminded voters that women nurses were saving American soldiers on the front lines in Europe. Voters sent her opponent packing. Now in 1919, an Illinois congressman introduced the same suffrage measure that Aaron Sargent had sponsored 40 years earlier. This time it passed, and it was sent to the state legislatures for ratification. To become law, the amendment needed 36 legislators to agree, but it was stuck on 35. It all came down to Tennessee, but the southern states were adamantly opposed to the amendment, so the outlook appeared very bleak. The Tennessee Senate had voted for suffrage, but the House vote was tied at 48-48, when 24-year-old Harry Byrne stood to cast the deciding vote, He already had indicated he would vote no. But just before the vote, he was handed a letter. It was from the most influential person in his life, his mother. Do the right thing, the letter said. Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. Byrne did exactly what his mother told him to do. He put the letter in his coat pocket and cast the deciding vote for suffrage. Harry put it this way: I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow. I appreciated the fact that an opportunity to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine. Meanwhile, the women's movement had taken a new turn. Activists were looking beyond the 72-year struggle for suffrage to the day women would have a responsibility of shaping public policy. Thus, at its annual convention in 1920, the National American Women's Suffrage Association reinvented itself as the League of Women Voters. Its first imperative was to convince women to take advantage of the new political power they sought so hard to achieve. Another imperative was that the League would be in the forefront of social and government reform, but would be nonpartisan. In the 1920s, the League sponsored its first Get Out the Vote campaign.
In 1923, San Francisco's May Nolan became California's first female member of Congress and the fourth overall. She won a special election to succeed her husband, who had represented the city for nearly 10 years. In another special election in 1925, Florence Kahn was elected to Congress to succeed her late husband, who died in office during his 13th term. The first Jewish woman elected to Congress, Florence served a dozen years, a record that stood for females for 60 years until Nancy Pelosi broke that in 1999. Florence Kahn secured funds for construction of the Bay Bridge, and she won appropriations for various military installations in and around the city. She was a staunch Republican, and she was eminently quotable. Once she was accused of always towing the line of conservative New Hampshire Senator George Moses, and she quickly replied, "Why shouldn't I choose Moses as my leader? Haven't my people been following him for ages?" At the state capitol, however, after that breakthrough California election in 1918, in which the first 4 women were elected to the state assembly, only 10 other women would win assembly seats in the ensuing 56 years, and for a variety of reasons. During the Depression, for example, it was expected that men, as the head of the household, deserved jobs before women in politics or the general workplace. During World War II, women who wanted to work were expected to serve in the war effort in defense factories, not run for public office. In fact, for 10 years, starting in 1942, Catherine Niehaus was the only female in the legislature. Still, courageous women outside government found ways to produce dramatic public policy changes. In mid-decade, like Mary Tape 60 years earlier, Felicitas Mendez left a lasting imprint on California education. She was incensed when her children were turned away at their neighborhood school in Orange County and sent to an inferior, quote, Mexican-American school that was separated from a smelly dairy by an electrified fence. She and her husband sued the school district, and in 1947 won a landmark desegregation case. They were helped by Thurgood Marshall, who 7 years later used the same arguments to win the momentous national desegregation case before the US Supreme Court, Brown versus the Board of Education. The 1940s also saw the continued prominence of a woman named Leone Baxter, part of a San Francisco husband-wife team that wrote the book on political consulting. They had become the nation's first professional political campaign specialists that forever changed the way campaigns are run. For many years, they were the only professional campaign firm in the country. They made their first splash in a 1933 statewide campaign to save the Central Valley Project. Powerful PG&E had qualified a ballot measure to invalidate the project, but on a shoestring budget, Whitaker and Baxter shocked the experts by defeating the big utility. They ran a strategic campaign that for the first time used radio extensively, handling everything from scripts to sound effects. The following year, they attracted national attention when they raked in huge sums of campaign cash from the state's business community and swamped Upton Sinclair's run for governor. Sinclair, a socialist, had stunned the political establishment by winning the Democratic nomination. He spoke to struggling Californians and offered depression bromides, such as higher taxes for the wealthy, pensions for the aged and disabled, and state seizure of unused farmland. Working out of their San Francisco office, Whitaker and Baxter used money from the state's business community to run a brutal campaign that vilified Sinclairism with an overwhelming barrage of negative press coverage and campaign materials. One little-known campaign in 1946 involved San Francisco Mayor Roger Lapham, who was the target of a recall election after he had raised taxes and boosted fares on city streetcars. Whitaker and Baxter were hired to save his job. Baxter once said, "You can't wage a defensive campaign and win. To attack is to define the campaign agenda. But who do you attack in a recall when the mayor has no opponent?" Mindful that the Board of Supervisors would appoint a replacement mayor if the recall succeeded, Baxter came up with a brilliant strategy. Drawing on a restaurant tablecloth, she sketched a picture of a sinister man wearing a fancy suit, chomping on a big cigar with a tilted derby hat hiding most of his face. Baxter gave him a name, the Faceless Man, and then she created the campaign's theme. Who's behind the recall? Who's pulling the strings in this political puppet show? Don't surrender your city to the Faceless Man. Well, the Faceless Man was all over the newspapers and on radio and on billboards and pamphlets. One noted journalist later said, before the campaign was over, San Franciscans had been pumped so full of sound and fury that they would have lynched this faceless brute if they could have gotten their hands on him. Lapham survived. Over the years, Whitaker and Baxter helped elect Republican governors Frank Merriam, Earl Warren, and Goodwin Knight. They engineered dozens of successful ballot campaigns, primarily on behalf of the business community. And as one headline writer put it, they were the nearest thing the state had to a political boss.
Women still weren't winning elections in the 50s, early 60s. After all, women were expected to stay home with the kids and take advantage of the new household conveniences. As in the 40s, women outside government continued to find ways to make a difference. In fact, they jump-started California's environmental movement. In 1958, a group of Beverly Hills socialites, angry at government's inaction on air pollution, started a grassroots movement called Stamp Out Smog, SOS. They held marches, testified before city councils and the legislature, and built up a coalition that had tens of thousands of members. They had a hand in passing 150 state and local anti-smog laws, including the state's first attempt to regulate auto emissions. In the East Bay, meanwhile, 3 women were shocked to read a story in the Oakland Tribune in 1961 that predicted dire consequences for San Francisco Bay if plans for development continued, specifically the filling of more than 2,000 acres in Berkeley. All 3 had connections to UC Berkeley. Esther Gulick was married to a professor. Catherine Kerr was the wife of UC President Clark Kerr, and Sylvia McLaughlin's husband was a UC regent. The women built a large coalition and successfully lobbied the state to place a moratorium on filling the bay, as well as a commission to watch over shoreline development. They inspired other California women outside of government to work at improving our quality of life. The women's movement received a huge boost in 1960 with the government's approval of the birth control pill. That innovation enabled women to postpone childbearing while offering them opportunities to attend college and enter the workforce. Now, 1966 was a breakthrough year. March Fong of Oakland became the first Asian American woman to be elected to the legislature. As you can see from the photo, She also smashed a toilet on the steps of the Capitol to push her bill banning paid toilets in state buildings. Now, that was many, many years ago, but back then, in many public spaces, women had to carry around dimes to unlock public toilet stalls. Marge Fong went on to become California's first female Secretary of State. Also in 1966, another barrier was broken as Yvonne Brathwaite became the first African-American woman elected to the legislature. She went on to Congress, then enjoyed a long career on the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors. Now, in our research, we came across this San Francisco Examiner headline that called these two new assemblywomen, and I quote, beautiful and brainy. The article didn't deal with their qualifications or platforms. Instead, it emphasized their hairdos and fashion choices, and it ran in the women's section of the newspaper. Now, in our research, we didn't find any stories that referred to bald male lawmakers and their taste in business suits. In the mid-1970s, other barriers were smashed. In 1974, Janet Gray Hayes was elected the first woman mayor in San Jose's 197-year history. An ardent environmentalist, she also was the first woman to lead a United States city with a population of 500,000 or greater. 126 years after statehood, in 1976, Californians elected their first woman state senator, Roseanne Vuitch of Tulare County. When a male member would stand up on the floor of the Senate and out of habit referred to gentlemen of the Senate, Roseanne would ring a small porcelain bell that she kept on her desk to remind them of her presence. The Senate was so unprepared for her arrival that it didn't even have a women's restroom near the Senate floor. Today, there's a Rose Room dedicated in her honor.
History is still being written by San Francisco's Nancy Pelosi, who first won a seat in the House of Representatives 33 years ago, succeeding Sala Burton. Pelosi has since scaled unprecedented political heights. In 2007, she became the state's first female House Speaker, the highest elected woman official in U.S. history, and second in line to the presidency after the vice president. She also is the first person from California ever to hold that office as Speaker. From that lofty position, Pelosi has been instrumental in changing the course of history, putting her stamp on such game-changing legislation as the Affordable Care Act, consumer protection, Wall Street reform, economic development, and civil rights. And then there was Dianne Feinstein. As a teenager, Dianne had been a bit rebellious when she was about to graduate from high school. She had been accepted to both Cal and Stanford. Her father, Leon Goldman, a renowned surgeon at UC San Francisco, had gone to Cal and urged her to go to Cal, where there were a number of prominent Nobel laureates on the faculty. But Dianne was leaning towards Stanford because she wanted to attend a smaller school with smaller classes. Dr. Goldman then took his daughter aside and told her, quote, remember, it's better sitting 1,000 feet away from a genius than 100 feet away from a mediocrity. Now, as a sidelight, Susie and I really liked that story because both of us went to Cal. But Dianne Goldman ignored his advice and went to Stanford. While there, she was educated about gender issues in the world of politics. Women were not allowed to run for student body president at Stanford, so she ran for vice president against two men. At a campaign speech, men threw food at her and hauled her into a shower. She won with 63% of the vote. Feinstein's political career had advanced a major step forward in 1969 when she was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and later became its first female president. She made two unsuccessful runs for mayor. And then on November 27th, 1978, she walked into the City Hall press room and casually told a few reporters that she would finish her term and then retire from politics. She figured she had gone as far as she could. Barely 2 hours later, former San Francisco Supervisor Dan White slipped through a basement window at City Hall. with a loaded revolver. A former police officer, White eluded newly placed metal detectors and calmly walked into the office of Mayor George Moscone. White had resigned his job as supervisor, then changed his mind. He asked Moscone for his job back, and Moscone refused. White then shot Moscone twice in the back and twice in the head. He reloaded and then walked into the office of Supervisor Harvey Milk, San Francisco's first openly gay supervisor. He shot Milk 5 times. A few minutes later, a shaken but resolute Feinstein, as president of the board, stood on the steps of City Hall and announced that both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk had been shot and killed. Feinstein succeeded Moscone as mayor, becoming the first woman to hold that post. In 1979, she was elected mayor in her own right, and 4 years later, she was reelected. She was considered a moderate, center-left mayor in a liberal city. She focused on public safety, fiscal responsibility, international trade, and the emerging AIDS crisis. Political experts thought she was perfectly positioned to become California's first woman governor. In 1990, she defeated State Attorney General John Vandekamp in the Democratic primary for governor, becoming the first woman in state history to be selected as a major party nominee for governor. She had promised to name women to half of the government jobs and judicial posts if she won the governor's contest, but she fell short, losing to Republican Pete Wilson. Now, while Feinstein did not win in 1990, she and Barbara Boxer of Marin County both won Senate seats in 1992, making California the first state to be represented by 2 females simultaneously in the Senate, and today it still is. Feinstein authored the federal assault weapons ban in 1994, which expired 10 years later. Her subsequent attempts to renew the ban have not been successful. In November 2022, she will become the longest-serving female senator in history. Boxer, who retired in 2016, was an ardent environmentalist. She authored legislation blocking oil drilling on fragile lands, protecting the oceans, and reducing energy consumption.
In the 2018 elections, many women, of course, were motivated by the Me Too movement that began in California, amid concerns that the Trump administration and the courts might reverse some of the public policy gains they had won over the years. For the first time in California history, California now has 3 statewide female constitutional officers serving simultaneously, all Bay Area daughters of immigrants. Eleni Kounalakis is the state's first woman lieutenant governor. Betty Yee is the state controller, and Fiona Ma is treasurer. But California remains one of only 20 states that has never elected a female governor, although 3 women have received major party nominations since 1990. Women now comprise nearly 1/3 of the legislature, with a record 38 members in the combined Assembly and Senate. And it's more racially diverse than ever before, better reflecting the state's demographics. And the Senate leader, Toni Atkins, not only is the first woman to head the upper house, she's also is the first to come from California's LGBTQ community. She previously was Speaker of the Assembly. Now, there are many reasons why women need to become key players in the development of public policy. Studies show that women are more prone than men to seek consensus on contentious matters, and consensus leads to problem solving. Further, women bring a different perspective to issues, and often they take up matters that men seem to ignore. Currently, 3 of the 4 legislative leaders are women. Now, when I started in the legislature, those many years ago, there were only 3 women lawmakers, period. With the gradual increase in female representation beginning in the 70s and the 80s, came more women staffers and consultants, more women lobbyists, more female Capitol reporters, and more attention to issues that women care about. Finally, and I speak from firsthand experience, there's a workable process to deal with rampant sexual harassment. And since growth at the state level often begins locally, It is encouraging that we now have a long list of office holders in the 9 Bay Area counties, including more than a dozen mayors. Women pioneers and activists have been battling the odds and taking political risks for 170 years now, and they've been making a difference, paving the way, if you will, since statehood, becoming role models for future generations of leaders. Now, we've really enjoyed putting this presentation together for you. And again, congratulations to the State Library for its 170th anniversary. For those of you who would like to read more about these and other remarkable women, you can order discounted copies of our website at www.pavingthewaycalifornia.com. And we gladly will answer any questions, and you can put any additional questions in the chat box. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Steve and Susie, for your presentation. That was wonderful. So let's open it up now for any questions that are in the chat. Maddie, go ahead.
Yes, we've had some really great questions in the chat. Steve and Susie, was Sarah Pellet described possibly as shrill? What kind of adjectives did they use to describe her?
Yeah, that's a good question. She was. It was really interesting. The press, especially the Alta California newspaper back then, the press did not like her appearance. They said she was too short, that you couldn't see her face because the microphone hit it. I mean, and there were so many comments like that, as being shrill, with a high voice, unpleasant. A lot had to do with her demeanor and her delivery.
Great. We have another question. Why were the racial complexities of the suffrage movement that grew out of the abolitionist struggle, why did they not take center stage?
Well, I mean, that's interesting, because there was a group of suffragists who were upset that African Americans got the vote before they did. And so that created a rift in the suffrage movement. What is interesting, in 1896, basically African Americans weren't allowed into the suffrage movement, which was run by elite and upper middle class white women. However, there was a woman by the name of Naomi Anderson who basically formed her own suffrage movement, and she went down to Los Angeles and talked, in the churches, and talked in various communities to try to get the African American vote for women's suffrage. But at that time, there were only, I think, like 11,000 African Americans in California. So it would not have made much of a difference.
Mm-hmm. In your research, did you find new materials about Marietta Stowe? She was a vice president nominee on the Equal Rights Party when Belva Lockwood ran as president in 1884, and Maud Younger, who was a suffragist and an advocate for labor rights in San Francisco.
Yes, we did, as a matter of fact, and in our book, we do devote some time to them. Maud Younger was really interesting. I mean, she was a labor activist, super liberal, and she would give speeches often, and she was quite the activist. Yes.
And I think we have a follow-up question. What role did the effort for labor rights play in either securing support for suffrage or impeding it?
I don't. I think it was sort of a two-edged sword. There were obviously so many people in the business community, did not appreciate efforts by labor activists. And you got to remember that these were male voters who were deciding this issue. And the entire outreach for the suffrage campaigns went to the men because, again, they were the ones who were casting the votes.
I have another one. In an era of ostensibly universal suffrage, why did the members of the League of Women Voters feel they needed, and I'm not sure, Tatiana, if you can tell me what this stands for, GOTV campaigns?
Oh, yes, get out the vote.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I was thinking it was like a Game of Thrones.
Yes, they actually, before before Tennessee had officially put their stamp of approval on suffrage, the women, the Suffrage League had met, and they expected to be victorious. And that's when, in 1920, that's when they changed to the League of Women Voters. And what they realized is that now that we have the vote, what are we going to do with it? And so again, they made sure that they were nonpartisan, and get out the vote was extremely important, because they wanted to show the nation that now that we have the vote, we are using it. Because a lot of people, one of the arguments again was that women didn't really want this. And so they wanted to demonstrate that it was very important. So they started these programs in the communities to try to make sure that women actually went to the polls. And it was very important for them to do that.
Okay, I have another question from the audience. Can you talk about the role of Black suffragettes? I have heard a little bit about Hetty B., I'm going to probably say her name wrong, Tillman, and Fanny Jackson Chopin Club. I think maybe something got cut off in Oakland or Alameda.
Yeah,
I don't know how much they were involved with the white women you mentioned working for suffrage in California at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was a club in Oakland. It was in the East Bay. And what the problem was is that, you know, Selena Solomons really tried to get the working class women involved in the campaign, but there wasn't, you know, a great successful effort to get African Americans involved in the campaign. But African Americans took it upon themselves to create their own suffrage clubs and to work to get that measure passed. And that's, you know, you had this club in the East Bay, and you had other clubs, and they would send out emissaries primarily to the Black churches, you know, to talk to people and to try to exhort them to put some pressure on the men to vote for it.
And then we have a question about your podcast. I saw that you have on your website that you have one. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, it's not an ongoing podcast, but I mean, we could pick it up again, but that was a podcast we did through, I think it was Capital Weekly. And it was just basically a discussion of the book and how we did some of our research and some of our findings. That's on the website, that podcast.
Maybe with the shelter in place, you guys can pick it up for sure, because
yes, we have nothing else to do.
Yeah, exactly. No one has anything else to do.
Oh no. Okay, Susie's reminding me.
Yeah, that podcast was set up by the state librarian, Greg Lucas.
Oh, wonderful.
That's right.
Nice plug.
Right.
Yeah, but he did. I have to give him credit.
Yeah, he put that together. The state library does a number of these podcasts, and that's one of the things that Greg has really tried to institute and to modernize the state library. And so they do podcasts on various subjects, and we were lucky to be the subject of one of them.
Wonderful. So Suzanne has a comment regarding the division in the suffrage over Black men getting the vote before women. It's not what I have studied and understood. The NWSA and AWSA split because the NWSA wanted to vote for all and didn't want to support the 14th and the 15th Amendments that introduced males into the Constitution. But the AWSA was the one that employed the Southern strategy that encouraged getting the vote for white women only to balance out the newly gained Black vote after the 15th Amendment.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, I thought we alluded to that, but and basically there was a split in the suffrage movement, you know, based on the Black vote, and the fact that you know, some people were angry and upset that African Americans could vote but women couldn't. Yeah, Susan B. Anthony was one of them.
So that is the last of the questions that came in through the chat. Are there any other questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have one and ask a live question.
You know, while you're waiting for those, I have one other story that we left out, which is kind of interesting and apropos these days. And do you want to tell that? Susie has.
My voice.
His voice is faltering. Back in 1918, a woman by the name of Mabel Anderson, a doctor, a physician from Oakland, she ran for the state Senate, and she wanted to become, obviously, the first woman state senator. She ran a good campaign, but she didn't make it out of the primary. But later on that year in 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic hit, right? We all know about that. And her sister, living in a small copper mining town of Jerome, Arizona, fell ill. So she rushed to Arizona to help her sister. She nursed her back to health, and then, at her own peril, stayed in Arizona, which was a real hot spot at the time, and helped the local health authorities. On her way back, she fell ill. Then it was time for her sister to try to rush to Mabel Anthony's bedside to help her. So the sister gets on a train, heads for California. Right across the state line in Needles, there is a derailment. The train is delayed by a few hours. By the time she pulls into Oakland and gets to the hospital, her sister had died just a few hours earlier. It's a real sad story, but it's sort of reminiscent of what some people are going through these days with the pandemic.
Exactly. Other questions for Steve and Susie Swatt?
One other thing I'd like to mention is there are oral histories. And a lot of women who have been in positions in California and state government, etc., there are oral histories that are available through the Secretary of State's office, through Berkeley's library in Berkeley. And so they're very interesting to read because a lot of these interviews, or most of these interviews, are done after people have left office. So they're very brutally honest about things in many occasions. So it's very, very interesting to read these, and you can do that online. I've worked again with our state librarian, Greg Lucas. The oral histories had been stopped for 15 years, and we were able to work to get funding in the state budgets in recent years, provide for additional oral histories, because a lot more of the women were elected to office in the 90s, and we were losing the women who had been there, and many of them had passed away, and it was such a shame to have lost the vital information that they could have provided for people for the future. So that's another project that we're just involved in keeping women alive and make certain that the things that they had done have been recorded.
And of course, this is a small budget issue, but in these days, we're not sure what that state budget is going to actually look like.
Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So thank you again to Steve and Susie for their presentation. Again, the recording will be made available on the California State Library YouTube channel, and hopefully in the next couple of days. And we ask you again, please fill out the survey, and we hope to see you all at our next event, August 7th, which is a Friday at 4 p.m. in honor of Adolf Sutro. Thank you, Steve and Susie. Let's give them an applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay, it was so informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Devorah, did you have a slide? So I'll stop recording, and then you were going to put up, do we still have that post survey slide?
Oh yeah, I could put that back up. One moment.